talk about the difference in working with John and with Paul?
John used to find it hard to express himself, and I was in a position where I really had to read his mind, and he didn't have a lot of patience, and he would accept something that was sort of 95% good, whereas Paul would want it 100% good. So Paul to me has always been the musician, and the one that sort of, for want of a better phrase, the musician sort of musician. I mean, Paul was a good drummer and a good guitarist, good keyboard player, and he sort of held the band and brought them to that sort of perfection part of things, where John would let things easily go. And also John, of course, did not like the sound of his voice either. No matter how much you told him how great his voice sounded, he always wanted like the tape echo on it, or something done to it, which normally was screwing the EQ around or ADTing it and making it sound slightly different. And he had a great voice. I mean, so much soul and heart in his voice. But it's very hard to find out I could never find out where that was coming from, because of watching him, as a person. Because doing this job, you're sort of a bit of a psychologist and psychiatrist, But I could never get the inner John to find out where all this emotion was coming from, because sometimes of the looks on his face, But it was coming from deep down somewhere. And I didn't know a lot about his private or personal life, If I'd probably known more about that, I would have had a better insight into John, as a person.
In the beginning, it was presented with, as John the leader. I mean, I think on the back of Meet the Beatles it even says, and their leader, John Lennon. Yeah. Was that accurate?
I didn't really focus in on that at all. I mean, I just knew what I saw, happen within the confines of the studio, that like Paul was the one that sort of saved the situation always, and the one who always went that little bit extra to perfect things, and especially, of course, on Paul's songs we'd spend a considerable amount of time doing Paul's songs, because of, he knew exactly really what he wanted, whereas John didn't. So John, the time that was spent on some of John's songs was a bit less than Paul's songs. But if Paul, I think, thought that a John's song was going slightly a bit, lopsided, he'd interject and sort of make sure it really was polished,
Certainly one of the transformations within the book is the surprise to hear to read that lack of confidence and lack of, fully developed skill in George's part as a soloist. You sort of don't hear about that limitation as much.
Because when he first walked in the studio, he was only 18 years old, He wasn't a prolific guitarist, and he had trouble, I can see George's face now when we were doing guitars on. Well, I mean, Taxman's probably a good example. When Paul actually ended up doing the solo on that, because he was getting so frustrated that George couldn't. Because Paul was like, more. Anyway, Paul was Paul. There's always a look at whenever George, it was like George's turn, it was, you could see he was sort of under sort of a pressure, and he was always like looking elsewhere for something, another place to be. Because I'm sure as a songwriter he did realise that his songs weren't of the calibre of John and Paul's songs. Because eventually, when he starts writing songs like Something, it's brilliant, and his guitar playing. And he did find his sort of niche in the Eastern music, and which was great for him, obviously. And so as the book progresses, it's like a human story of George, probably the insecure guitarist, becoming the true artist that he was, in the end, which is great,
It's striking to hear the way that you characterize Ringo through the sessions.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the one that, whatever, from the movies or whatever, was out there, was established as he's sort of the goofy, the more sort of sad sack, happy-go-lucky one, whatever. And that he's, what you describe through the sessions is more sort of distanced and...
Yeah, Ringo, he sat in his little sort of half a drum booth. Those songs were constructed in the studio, and sometimes we might spend 3 or 4 hours doing a version or working it out, and then suddenly they'd say, oh no, that's the wrong rhythm or whatever. But Ringo would like be in there from the start of the session to the end of the session, and normally the session would end when Ringo was so exhausted that enough was enough, and he just drummed hour upon hour upon hour upon hour. When he used to leave in the evening, there was wood chips all over the carpet. We'd been through so many drumsticks, and I was always getting him to hit the drums as hard as he possibly could, especially with that snare sound. I mean, as soon as he didn't attack it the way I was used to hearing it attacked. That sound wasn't there, and so he was really exhausted by the end of the day. And the session normally ended when Ringo got up from the drum kit and got his coat, and everyone knew that was the end of the session.